Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this November Independent Socialists in Wellingborough meeting. I'm delighted that we have a guest speaker, Fred Leplat, who is going to talk to us, or start a discussion, hopefully start some dialogue and a discussion on the theme of Ukraine, voices of resistance and solidarity. And this was prompted by the recent publication of a small book by Socialist Resistance Books on this particular theme, with speakers or authors from a variety of different perspectives around the Ukraine situation. But it's billed as a collection of recent writings by Ukrainians and socialists from around the world. And I'm particularly pleased that we're able to get Fred along at the time when this book has just been launched. I believe it was in October. Fred himself is a member of socialist resistance and anti-capitalist resistance, and has been a political activist for many years. And I believe, Fred, that you expelled from the Labour Party at some point, and along with a number of other people, following the Corbyn scenario. So, just formally like to welcome you to Independent Socialists in Wellingborough, and invite you to kick off. And if you want to introduce yourself again, say a bit more about who you are.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, I mean, as Paul was saying, I'm a member of anti-capitalist resistance. I help produce books for a little kitchen table, my kitchen table, in fact, a publishing house, which is Resistance Books, but we got quite a few titles which you can have a look on the Resistance Book website. And I've been involved with the Ukraine Solidarity. Originally, I was involved with it in 2014. And the person who launched it, Chris Ford, who is Ukraine. Well, he's not Ukrainian, but he speaks Ukrainian. He does some research on Ukraine. He's written on it. So he kept it going since 2014, which is when Russia had invaded and annexed Crimea, and he's kept it going. And it plays an important role because it's a progressive left-wing socialist campaign of solidarity with the Ukrainian people, and makes particular effort to be in contact and in solidarity with left-wing progressive trade union organizations. And there are some in Ukraine, and we shouldn't forget that. And that's why we decided to publish this book as rapidly as possible. And it's called Voices of Resistance and Solidarity, precisely because it's about, it's by authors who are Ukrainians in Ukraine, writing about why they are resisting the Russian invasion and occupation of their country, why they believe that the reconstruction of the country should be on the basis of social and economic justice, and they are independent voices. They are not part of the Zelensky government. You know, they have their differences, and they've campaigned against measures of the Zelensky government, while at the same time being part and integrated in the armed forces, in the territorial units, fighting the Russian occupation, invasion, and destruction of their country. So that's why we decided to produce that book, because unfortunately on the left there's too much talk about Ukraine being a monolithic block of people who are all pro-Western, got illusions in the European Union, illusions in NATO, and many of them are fascist, etc., etc. And well, of course, it is true that like many other countries around Europe, many Ukrainians, probably a majority of them, do have illusions in the West, do want to have support from NATO, etc. And I'll come back onto that later on. It's not a unanimous voice, and I think it's important that we hear those voices, because they've got a distinctive voice, which we here in Britain, in England, should be in solidarity and should give a platform to. So I think what we say as socialists and as members of Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, and myself as Anti-Capitalist Resistance, but there's others. There's other small organisations on the left and some MPs who support us, such as John McDonnell, Nadia Whittam, Mick Antoniff, who's a member of the Welsh Assembly. So we are a small but necessary component of the solidarity campaign with Ukraine, giving voices, socialist voices, anti-imperialist voices, and internationalist voices. And I stress that because as socialists, we need to be in solidarity with the working class and the oppressed in all its diversity across the world. That should be our starting point. And solidarity with them in their fight against oppression, for independence, for liberation, for whatever they wish to fight for democracy. And we do that in solidarity with the people. And as socialists, we recognise that today we live in it's a global capitalist system. It's a global imperialist system, imperialist because they are centres which are bigger than others. The United States, for example, but other imperialist centres which are capitalists who want to expand their economic reach, and they do that by different means, militarily means, economic means. And imperialism works, both with the mailed fist of military power on the one hand and the velvet glove of economic sanctions, debt, economic restructuring, privatization, all those sorts of things, right? Western capitalism in the 19th century, did it through military means and then eventually did it by economic means as well. Russia's doing it, and I would consider Russia being an imperialist country, but certainly is doing it also now by military means, and has done that, in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria, to expand its reach, and is doing it now since 2014 in Ukraine. So, and I stress this because even though the United States is the biggest imperialist country, it's got 11 aircraft carriers, which I think is more or as many as the rest of the world put together. I think Russia's got one. Britain might have two, Italy's got two, Australia's got one. I think China's just got one aircraft carrier. So just that does tell you something about US imperialist military might. But nevertheless, even though it's the strongest imperialist country in the world, it doesn't mean that those capitalist countries that are opposing it or are trying to find their own spheres of influence and therefore come into conflict with US imperialism. It doesn't mean that those other countries are in themselves in any way progressive. The enemy of our enemies are not our friends, right? They're not even possibly our friends. They're still, Russian imperialism, French imperialism, British imperialism, even Belgium imperialism, right? They are capitalist imperialist countries, and we don't consider them our friends, or China or whatever, right? We are in solidarity with the people, the working class and the oppressed around the world, fighting for their liberation and their independence and their democracy. And we do that, I would argue, regardless of the character of the regimes or the governments in which they live, right? We do that. We may do that unconditionally, but we certainly do that critically as well, right? When we say solidarity with the people of Ukraine, it's with the people of Ukraine, and we recognise that the Zelensky government, in this instance, is pro-Western. It's a capitalist government, right? It has introduced, it's tried to introduce legislation, anti-labour legislation, which liberalises labour laws, etc. And we're familiar with that here. It's done that with the support and advice of the British government, for example. And just like the socialists in Ukraine, just like the trade unionists in Ukraine, they are resisting their own government, Zelensky's government's neoliberal turn. We are so in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and can be critical also of the Zelensky government. So what is the character of the war? Right, I think that's important. Right, secondly, I'd like to move on. Just to come back on, solidarity with the people of Ukraine, right? I mean, we've done that. I think as socialists, we've done that with many other struggles around the world. Whether it's Vietnam or Vietnam Solidarity Campaign, or whether it's anti-apartheid movement, or it's Palestine, etc., etc. We don't necessarily agree with the character of those governments or those, those regimes, right? But we are in solidarity with those people fighting for their liberation, for their independence, for their democracy. And I don't think in that respect there's much new in terms of the principle in terms of Ukraine. So what is the character of the war? I mean, it is an appalling war, frankly. An invasion on the 24th of February. It's with untold deaths. Probably I think atrocities committed by Russian troops, Putin's troops, right? Which I'll go back on, right? Because it's important to note that but the character of the war, first and foremost, is a war by Ukrainian people, by the Ukrainian nation, for independence, against occupation, for the liberation of their country. That's the first thing, right? Now, of course, initially, Western imperialism and some of us here believe that maybe, the Russian army being so big, it would crush immediately the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian army. But that was not to be, because precisely, a war of independence, a war of liberation, a war for democracy, can motivate people to fight for a better future, or at least to fight against the invasion, the brutality of the occupying forces. And I don't know if you remember, but at the beginning, the Zelensky government mobilized the population by handing out Kalashnikov rifles. Just anybody who wanted to fight got a Kalashnikov rifles. They organized men and women, those not who were able to fight, to produce Molotov cocktails in the streets, right? Those remember that. So there's a tremendous popular mobilization for the independence and for the liberation of their country. But of course, it would be a surprise. It would be a surprise if Western imperialism did not seek the opportunity of this war to try and reestablish or try to seek to influence events, right? And so therefore the character of the war, while it being primarily that of a war liberation and independence, there's also other characters in the war, right? A war between Western imperialism through NATO and Russian imperialism, and that's nothing new in this war. I mean, we've seen that in other wars. I mean, the Second World War, there was an anti-imperialist war. There was a war between Nazi imperialism and Soviet and the Soviet non-capitalist country. There was wars of colonial liberation from colonialism in the Second World War. There was also wars for liberation of France, occupied France, occupied Italy, occupied Netherlands, etc., etc. So it was a multifaceted war, and this one here as well is a multifaceted war. But that it's not because the Western imperialism and NATO are trying to are doing that for cynical reasons. Frankly, it's in their own economic interest to try and crush Russian capitalism and to try and win Ukraine back into its orbit. That it should stop us from being in solidarity with the Ukrainian people. And in their war for independence and liberation. So that support should be unconditional and but critical where it should be. Now, just to come back to Putin's motivation, as I said, it was clearly a war of. It is clearly a war of an imperialist war. Wants to grab resources of the east of Ukraine, which is where most minerals, mines, etc., are located, and it's dressed that up in a nationalist and racist rhetoric of Ukraine never really existed as an independent country. Its culture, its language, these things don't exist. And anyway, Ukraine's always been part of Russia. And Lenin was wrong. It's the reason why Ukraine suddenly became independent. It all goes back to Lenin, because under Lenin, in the Soviet Union for a brief period, there was it broke away from the Russian Tsarist prison of the nations, only for it to come back under Stalin. But nonetheless, it did create the USSR, which is the United Socialist Soviet Republics, right? United Soviet Republics, right? And it was a federation with some and the relative autonomy at the beginning did come back later on, in the 50s under Khrushchev, where there was independent publications in their own languages in Ukraine and other countries. Solzhenitsyn was published in the Soviet Union in the 1950s. A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was published in the Soviet Union. But of course, since then, the collapse of the Soviet Union has led to fragmentation, independence of countries, and it will support the independence, the right of nations for independence, and Ukraine gave up its, in 1994, gave up all its nuclear weapons in an agreement with Russia in exchange for Russia recognizing its sovereignty, which obviously that's all gone by the board now. But the racist and nationalist rhetoric and xenophobic rhetoric that Putin has raised, we are fighting fascists, right? They're all fascists, right? The Zelensky government is a fascist government. We're doing again the Second World War. Flying again, red flags with a hammer and sickle and so on, has spread a culture of brutality amongst the Russian troops, and that's led to the atrocities that we've seen in Bucha, Irzun, and elsewhere. Atrocities which are war crimes, and I think we could even go further. The stealing of cultural artifacts from museums. The deliberate destruction of schools and hospitals, etc., would come under the category of genocide. Genocide is not just the physical extermination of a population, whether it's Jewish or Armenian or Tutsi, by the Rwandan conflict, right? It's a wider definition under the UN, but defined by the United Nations. And if there are war crimes committed by Ukrainian soldiers, they should be tried as well, right? And let's not be clear about that. Zelensky has said that he would try those accused of war crimes, right? Unlike Putin, who has not said so. Just to come back on the question of the fascists, right? I mentioned socialist trade unions, which do exist, right? And of course, fascists. There are fascists, who nostalgics of the Bandera era. The nationalists who were fighting alongside the Nazis in the Second World War, and the previous president of Ukraine had made Bandera a national hero, which was reversed later on, right? But let's look at France, Italy, Hungary, and other countries. They are fascists there as well. They might not be in uniform. They're wearing a suit, but as George Orwell said after the Second World War, the next time that the fascists come, they will be wearing a suit, right? So, but the character of the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian state, right, is not that of a fascist state. Absolutely not, right? It might be, neoliberal, pro-Western, all those sorts of things. But Zelensky himself, is of Jewish heritage. He's a Russian speaker himself. And he won the election 3 years ago, I think, or 4 years ago, with 73% of the vote. He won every single, he came ahead in every single, area of voting, right, except for one, Lviv in the far west, right, beating the previous candidate, Poroshenko, I think it was, Poroshenko, who was a pro-Western but nationalist, right, and who undoubtedly did want and base his regime, his government on ethno-nationalism. Undoubtedly he wanted to reimpose Ukrainian language in the West and not recognize, that Ukraine, like many countries in Europe, is multi-ethnic and has got minority languages, etc., etc. And the socialists in Ukraine and the left in Ukraine, the trade unions do recognize that and do fight for national, cultural, and linguistic rights. So, and that's why we should be in support of them. Just to conclude a few final things now, right? I've mentioned Well, just a couple of things right now. What has Russian intervention done for NATO and for Western imperialism? It's given it a reason to exist again. After the two, one of the reasons that Putin said he needed to invade Ukraine was because of the threat from NATO. Now, at no time was Ukraine, and certainly not NATO, an imminent threat of invasion or of war against Russia. Of course, there's been NATO expansion up until 2000. I think the last admission into NATO was 2014, right? But and of course we opposed NATO and expansionism, etc. And NATO never sees the opportunity of the fall of the Western imperialism, never sees the opportunity of the fall of the wall in Berlin to have a new security understanding across the whole of Europe. It ignored that. But a possible threat in the distant future was no reason for Putin to invade Ukraine. But it's given NATO a new lease of life. When it was NATO who invaded Afghanistan back in 2001, it was a fight against terrorism. It was a fight, it was a clash of civilization. And we had to fight, this unending fight, and we still are, or our governments are fighting this unending fight against terrorism. But now suddenly it's become a fight for democracy. And that's a hypocritical thing for the West to say, a cynical thing for Western imperialism and NATO to say, because they had never intervened in their invasion of Iraq was not about democracy. Was prepared to work with Saddam Hussein in the past. Is very happy to work with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc. And up until now was very happy doing business with Putin and his regime, which just to come back to your previous point, is certainly on the political spectrum much further to the right than the regime in Ukraine under Zelensky. I think Putin's part of the far right nationalist spectrum that we see now with Meloni in Italy, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump, etc. Right? A creeping fascism that we have to resist. So it's given a new lease of life for NATO, which is unfortunate. And this militarization we have to resist. We have to resist the militarization that NATO is creating around the world. But it doesn't mean that we should not, in saying that we support the Ukrainian people resisting their invasion, their destruction of the country, and wanting to fight for liberation, we still support. In doing that, they have to fight. They need arms. If we said no arm, it says you can fight, but just do what you got in Ukraine. The war would have been over a few months ago. A few months after the invasion. So what Ukraine Solidarity Campaign says is that Ukrainian people should be able to get the arms from wherever they can, without illusions and without strings. Right, without illusions, because NATO, the West, because that's the only place in practice now that arms are being delivered to Ukraine. Unfortunately, Cuba is not in that position to do that any longer. It's it did a great job in Southern Africa and and elsewhere in Latin America in the last century, but not now, right? And we say without illusions, because NATO will dump Ukraine if it feels that, if Western imperialism, Western capitalism feels that the war has gone too long, is damaging the economic situation too much, and the price is no longer worth paying. We want Russian gas, we want Russian oil, rather than going down, a green transition, an urgent green transition, which would be possible to do that now. So they've done, they've done that in the past. Recently. The Kurds in Kobane in northern Syria, who were under attack, under imminent threat from ISIS and from the Assad regime. Assad was allowing the ISIS to crush the Kurds in Kobane. The Kurds phoned up, the US and said, "Help us," right? And because the US imperialism, for its own cynical reasons, realized that the Kurdish forces were the only force capable of destroying ISIS. They made a temporary alliance, right? And they gave military aid to the Kurds, bombing in, dropping arms, and the Kurds defeated, the YPG defeated ISIS, pushed them back, right? And as soon as that was done, it stopped the support and then allowed the Turkish army to start hammering the Kurds, right? And if you follow that, if you follow a bit about the history, the Kurds knew that because they've been, they know their history and they've been done over in the past by Muslim people. I'll conclude. I've been going a bit too long now, haven't I? Right. Okay. Thank you. Well, I'll leave it at that. I had a lot to say, but right. So no peace. So, and without illusion, because there can be no peace deals behind the backs of the Ukrainian people. Right. It's up to the Ukrainians to decide, what peace deals they want to do, if they want, and when to have it, under what conditions, and as long as they want to fight, then we should support them. Full stop.
Thank you very much, Fred.
Thanks for winding me up, Tony.
I expected that you might go on for a little bit longer than 15 minutes, but that's not a problem. But it's now over to others that may want to make contributions or to ask Fred questions. If you could indicate via the I think it's the reactions button. If you could raise your hand, then I can open. You can unmute yourself, and when I say, and you can have your say. Who'd like to kick off? Joseph, please come in. Unmute yourself.
Yes, well, being a fellow member of ACR, it's not surprising to have a similar view as Fred's. However, being the international officer of Left Unity has sometimes left me in a minority position on that party's executive, where some are of the view, particularly people like Kate Hudson, that nuclear war is the World War III type scenario as the overriding danger. And also many are still very much coming from the campus tradition that, the major threat is NATO, and when all is boiled down, it's all due really to Western arms dealers and imperialism, which I think is a very, simplistic and outdated view. Just to explain that I did my PhD actually on the last attempt at Ukrainian independence, which was in the early 20th century, after the collapse of the Russian Empire. And I remember when people would ask me, what are you doing your doctorate on? And I tell them their eyes would glaze over, because in those days, Ukraine was somewhere that nobody knew about. It's quite a change now from 20 years ago. But it's interesting that there are many parallels between the situation then and the situation now. And Putin's ahistorical lectures on the history of Ukraine are quite incredible, because essentially what he's really peddling is the ideas of Tsarist Russia, the recreation of the Russian Empire. And he actually pursues the policy of Novaya Rossiya, New Russia, which was Catherine the Great's idea of colonizing the area near the Black Sea and moving into the grain growing areas of Ukraine and so on. And it's very interesting, the Potemkins, when the Russian army occupied Kherson, they removed Potemkin's body, which was interred in the cathedral there, back to Russia, because he's seen as, if you like, the spiritual leader of Novaya Rossiya, because it was his campaigns in the south, so on, which conquered that territory for Russia. So there's a lot of Tsarism Mark II in all of this. And it's very interesting that there's been some discussion recently that because Kazakhstan is not towing the line in terms of Russia's sphere of influence, that Kazakhstan might be the next for the treatment if they succeed in Ukraine. So there is a whole policy here, I believe, in reconstructing the Russian Empire. And a lot of Russia's neighbors are feeling very, very nervous. And there is no doubt that Russian imperialism is very, very dangerous and is a factor. And in fact, if you watch on Twitter, for example, some of the Russian broadcasts, Russian television, some of the speakers there, the Kremlin spokespersons, and also the nationalist, the extreme nationalist speakers on those shows are just that what they're saying is hair-raising. When they talk about total extermination of Ukraine, I was watching a program yesterday where they were talking about let's nuke them, let's completely annihilate, every aspect of Ukrainian culture and so on. I mean, it is really horrendous stuff. This is the sort of propaganda which the Russian people are listening to. So I think, people on the left in the West, I think sometimes have very naive views of the nature of Russian imperialism. And as Fred said, the self-determination of any people, how can that be achieved in reality if they are not actually able to protect themselves? And, as an Irish Republican coming from an Irish background of a people who rose up approximately every 50 years against the British, I very much identify with the movement for Ukrainian independence. I mean, there's no doubt that they are a separate people. They have a separate language and they have a separate identity. It's quite amazing that this issue has split some of the quite large, in Germany, for example, Die Linke, the German left party, has split down the middle over this issue. And the people in Die Linke who are arguing against supporting Ukraine are making the argument that the cost of the war is undermining the living standards of the working class in Germany by calling for energy sacrifices and so on. I think it's a very mendacious argument, and it's happening in other countries in Europe as well. There have been quite large demonstrations against the war, against supporting the war, and it's being used by a combination of Stalinists and the far right, to orientate towards a pro-Russian position. And I'm sure if there are power cuts and whatever here in the winter, we will hear similar arguments being made. But my major concern about all of this, apart from the nuclear threat, and there is an issue, for example, of the Zaporizhia power station that, there have been a number of missile hits very near there. That is a very critical situation. My concern would be that Putin's policy is to wear down the will of people in Europe, as I said, with power cuts and all the rest. But on top of that, with the recession and the continuing cost of the war, I think the Russian strategy is to hope that support will crumble further west. I think it's something we should watch.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for that contribution. Who else would like to have a say? Tony, did I see you? Could you unmute yourself, please? Tony, are you unmuted? You're not unmuted yet.
It's a most complicated and emotive. I just I just think in Ukraine there are people of extraordinary bravery and courage in the face of overwhelming violence, but I'm also concerned about those people in Russia who want freedom and who are also acting very bravely. The thing is beholden on us to try to think about quite what some of the forces that you've touched upon, Fred, and elaborate a bit on them. I think Putin is unpredictable, and I think, had he not been of that particular disposition in terms of maintaining his power, the West would have gone along quite happily with a collaboration with Russian oligarchs and Western oligarchs, and they had it all stitched up. And to some extent, he is, he's in the pack of cards, but it's not quite clear how he operates. Clearly, there is something of a network which goes beyond Russia. So it's not just Putin. It's about alliances with other countries like Iran, like Turkey. And so it's complicated in that way. Foreseeing a future, are we talking about a sort of stalemate war, which carries on much like the First World War, grumbles on? Are we talking about the defeat of something? I don't think so, as in the Second World War. And if we look at the current situation as socialists, I really feel uncomfortable about depending upon this sort of Western military armaments business and complex, because without that, at this point in time, Ukraine would have been, it's likely that it would have been subjected by Russia, because it is Russia, it is the Western armaments industry, including this country, which actually essentially depends upon arms. You know, arms are at the core of this country. Without arms in this country, without an armaments industry, we would, you know, what is our manufacturing industry? It's weapons. So you've got this uncomfortable feeling that actually Ukraine is backed up by that. And then you've got, looking into the future, as you've said, Fred, you know, at what point does the Western arms tied up with NATO, which is all the same thing, basically, at what point does it just, you know, throw in the towel and say, well, you know, we've been here for 4 years, 5 years. NATO certainly, as you said, left having failed in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they're partly there in Ukraine because they screwed up so well in Afghanistan and Iraq. So looking to the future, there's every possibility that Western armaments and the Western sort of military and armaments complex will get more interested in China, and will somehow, you know, the stalemate, as in the First World War, will just be papered over, but there'll really still be huge problems. I applaud your arguing for a socialist future in Ukraine. It worries me that, in fact, there's a considerable danger that right-wing nationalism will appeal to Ukrainians, but it may not. You know, during the course of the Second World War in this country, people turned to the left after war, having suffered. You know, there's a point which people say, well, as far as I can imagine, having talked to, you know, older generations, that they thought, well, we've suffered huge amounts in the Second World War, where we've suffered for something, and we want it to be better. We want, you know, we want socialism because we want a better society to live in. So that was a strong motivation, but how likely, you know, that is, we don't know what will happen in Ukraine. We don't know whether Ukrainian, after all the suffering, will be much more drawn to, you know, a right-wing, insular, nationalistic outlook. We survived the war with Russia, but we only survived because of all our fighters and all the rest of it, and our armaments. Or did we, I suppose people ask themselves, did we survive and socialism survive because we wanted it to, because we had solidarity, or because we organized ourselves? I don't know. But it's a horrible situation, and I certainly don't know quite how this is all going to, you know, it's going to end.
Thanks, Tony. Dave, if you'd like to.
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation, Fred. You know, I take a great heart from the way the Ukrainian people are tackling this awful situation, which to some extent is gone over some of the points that I wanted to talk about. I mean, it seems to me that it's certainly in the actual interests of the armaments industry in the United Kingdom and America to actually keep the war going. I'm not even sure that if we end up with spring power cuts, it'll make any difference to that, because I don't suppose those power cuts are going to hit America, are they? And they're probably the main protagonists in terms of keeping the fighting going. But we now have a situation where the Russians are pretty much dug in, as I understand it, on one side of the river. Is the Dnipro River, is it? They're dug in on one side, and with the winter approaching, probably little progress is going to be made. You can see the problem with that river is going to be an absolute nightmare if the Ukrainians were to attempt that at any time of the year. I mean, the main question is, how do you think this is going to end? Can I just leave you with that one?
Fred, did you want, nobody else lined up to speak, did you want to come back and perhaps, Derek indicating, so we'll take Derek and then I'll come back to you, Fred, if that's okay, because you may want to start with that last question. How do we think it's going to end? Which is a good one. But Derek, if you want to unmute.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. I've listened carefully to what's been said, and there's not much I can disagree with. I don't think anyone knows how it's going to end, but I'd like to take a different slant on this and actually widen it out a bit. If it hadn't been for the war in Ukraine, I don't think many people in this country would realize just how much we rely ourselves in Europe on Russian gas. I don't think we would have realized how much Europe and places like Kenya rely on Ukrainian grain. It's the breadbasket of quite large parts of the world. So no matter how this finishes, it has given various groups in the UK and around the world a cast iron argument for more fossil fuel development, becoming more independent energy-wise, and all the problems that will create as far as climate change is concerned. Climate change does not know international borders at all. And also, it also showed how fragile our food chains are. Something happening in one country sends ripples around the world, and countless tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people far away from Ukraine will be affected by the shortage of food and the development of fossil fuels, which really will do the rest of the world no good at all. That doesn't take away from the arguments, the points which have been made, but I really am concerned about the far-flung effects and people making money out of the situation between Russia and Ukraine.
Thanks, Derek. I mean, a really good point in terms of looking at the environmental or the consequences for us as global Earth of this conflict, and the way the contradictions that have been shown through by this conflict. You're absolutely spot on, I think. But we could go either way on the fossil fuels thing. It may be that there's an opportunity for a greater push for sustainable energy sources rather than going down the fossil fuel. Our government's going down the fossil fuel route. But that's not necessarily true of other parts of the world. There may be more of an impetus towards finding alternative energy sources through sustainable. But anyway, that's just an observation. But thank you very much, Nick, for introducing that wider context that this war has thrown into relief. Fred, did you want to come back? How's this war going to end, Fred? You need to unmute. You need to unmute.
I mean, we don't know how it's going to end, but I think what we need to ask is, what do the Ukrainians want? What do the Ukrainians people want, and how are they still motivated to carry on fighting, for the liberation of their country? And as far as I can tell, speaking to Ukrainians in London, there are many of them who are here in London who are supporters of socialist, the social movement, which are left-wing organizations, and we've been in contact with trade unions and so on and so forth. I mean, they want to, they want the country, they want Russian troops out. They want, a return to the borders as they were before the occupation of the Donbas region. Will they be able to do that? Well, I mean, and for them, actually, it includes Ukraine, right? It includes Crimea. Will they be able to do that? Well, we don't know. It depends on their resilience, on their motivation, and whether they've got the resource to do that, both military and economic, to do that. And obviously, and I agree with the points about, the UK arms industry. I think the arms industry and pharmaceuticals, apart from the city, are the three biggest components of the British economy. But Britain doesn't need to actually produce more weapons. It can, rather than giving or selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, and I think they sell something like 17 billion worth of equipment every year, right? It's there. We don't need to ramp up weapons production in Britain for the Ukrainians. And I think so. But I do feel, I agree. I feel uncomfortable about it. It's leading to militarization of the world, of our economies, and it puts pressure on and it also puts the Ukrainians in a very difficult position, as we said, about whether the arms may pull the plug on supplying arms. But just in terms of how it'll end, I mean, the Ukrainians want peace. I think they don't want the destruction of their country, but they don't want to be under occupation and incorporated into Russia. That's clearly, I think, for them, a bottom line. We don't have to that's no guesswork. Now, I think in terms of reconstruction, what after the war, I think that's a very good point. I'm more hopeful about what I don't think, okay, it might, obviously, the government is a neoliberal, pro-capitalist, or, facing towards the West in terms of its orientation, right? But there is a discussion in Ukraine about reconstruction. What sort of reconstruction? There's also been a tremendous amount of self-organization and self-help. Local communities looking after each other under these tremendous circumstances. So this self-organization will not disappear immediately after the war. And the other thing is I'm not so pessimistic about it being built on a Ukrainian ethno-nationalist basis, right? Because the war has brought together Ukrainians who are both mainly Russian speakers and mainly Ukrainian speakers. Some of the Ukrainian Russian speakers obviously have supported Russia and gone along with them, but it's a bilingual country in many respects. And I think seeing what Russia has done to part of their country has brought many of them together. So I'm not so pessimistic about it being on nationalist basis as we may fear, right? Because that was pushed back a bit by the defeat of Poroshenko in the election of Zelensky a few years ago. But of course, who knows what will happen, and we have to support all those who are fighting for democracy in a multi-ethnic, multicultural, multilinguistic country. Yeah. I mean, and yes, I mean, we there are sanctions on Russia, but not on Russian gas or oil. And we should be seizing this opportunity to having an urgent program for a green economy here in Britain. Instead, the government's gone for giving licenses to exploit oil production again and gas in the North Sea, because for energy security reasons. There you are. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Fred. What I'd like to suggest, nobody else has indicated at this point that they want to come back with any questions or comments. So if we take a 10-minute break at this point, come back at 8:10 with a view to finishing the meeting about 8:30, 8:45, something like that. Do people broadly agree with that? And I know that Joseph's got to go now, I think. So thanks, Joseph, for coming along, and we will perhaps see you at some future ISW meetings. You'd be very welcome. So a 10-minute break. You can stay. You can unmute and talk if you want. Don't just disappear. If you want to have a chat about things, please do. But I'm going to go downstairs to go to the loo and get a drink. So, but please don't disappear. We'll come back in 10 minutes. Well, it's now 2 minutes to 8. So if we come back just at round about 10 past 8. Thank you very much, everybody. Well, welcome back to the second half of this ISW meeting on the theme of Ukraine and solidarity with the people of Ukraine at this time. Could I perhaps kick off with a couple of comments of my own around this? One of the things which Fred referred to is the role of NATO, and the irony is, which I fail to see why people haven't grasped the significance of this, is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has massively strengthened, well, Fred referred to it, but massively strengthened NATO. And at a time when all of us, the left's supposed to be critical of NATO at best, if not totally against NATO, Russia has served the purpose of strengthening NATO, massively, with both Norway and Finland, both of whom have been neutral in the context of NATO since the Second World War. They've never really participated in any of the arrangements for security in Europe, and now rushing to wanting to join NATO. And this is quite bizarre, really, if you think about it. And indeed, all the Baltic states and any other states that are independent, that have borders with Russia, must also be contemplating wanting to join NATO in order to protect themselves, or theoretically protect themselves from Russian intervention. So I just fail to understand why the left, the socialist left, the progressive left around the world cannot see that Russia has played a major role rather than undermining NATO in actually strengthening it. The second thing, which I have serious problems understanding, is that, you know, the left and socialists have campaigned and supported nations for the right to self-determination and the right to be free from invasion and occupation by other nations, whether that be Palestine, whether that be Vietnam, whether that be Iraq. In all our politics, historically, we've campaigned and supported people in struggle against occupation and invasion, and yet somehow, when Russia invades Ukraine, suddenly it becomes problematic as to what the left should be saying about this. I really find this quite bizarre, and I've had arguments with people that I've historically worked with and respect on the left, who suddenly have a blind spot because the Ukraine is seeking support from NATO, and yet if this had been reversed, they'd have had no problems in supporting a country that, such as Ukraine, that's fighting for its right to exist as a nation. And finally, the question of arms, and Fred's touched on this, and I 100% agree. How can a country or peoples defend themselves from occupation and invasion unless they have arms to do that? I remember I cut my teeth in my early days as a 15, 16-year-old supporting the Vietnamese people in their struggle against US imperialism. And nobody would have said at that time that you deny them arms. Not only that, but you also know that those struggles sometimes take years and years and years. And a nation like Vietnam fought for its right to independence over 30, 40, 50-year period, first against French occupation and then American occupation. So, okay, the Ukraine scenario could go on for a long while. But why has that suddenly become an argument that you don't support the people struggling for independence and basically call for their capitulation? I fail to understand. If they want to continue to struggle, if the Ukrainian people themselves want to struggle for their rights to independence, I think we have a duty as socialists to support them, frankly. Irrespective of what role NATO's playing, they're always going to be cynical and exploit any conflict around the world for their own ends, but that doesn't stop us as socialists having principles and standing by them. Anyway, that's my contribution. Anybody else want to come in? or you want Roy? I can see you working up to it. Do you want to mute yourself, Roy?
I was plugging in the machine. It was getting a bit. Well, I will talk. I used to get paid for talking. I do it for free now. What do you want me to say? What I would say is that, yeah, Russia presently is not a great economic power, you know, and I suppose I'm repeating what's being said. It's under Putin's leadership that is trying to reenact the great days of the Tsar and to a certain extent Stalin, but he's doing it from a very low, relatively speaking, a very low base, because if you look at the GDP of Russia, You know, they're punching above their weight in a military sense. Maybe that's, well, mainly, I suppose, because of the legacy of the Soviet Union, which was heavily armed and so on, and was obviously a world power. So can Russia sustain what they're doing, bearing in mind that the cost of missiles is absolutely phenomenal? You know, people don't take that into consideration quite often. The second thing I think that will increasingly come into focus is that China, as the new world power, will increasingly be able to exert influence wherever it wants to. How will that influence be brought to bear on Russia? You know, I'm speculating. The other thing, it took a lot of us by surprise, is that we thought that Putin reenacting what was done to Czechoslovakia many years ago, the tanks would roll in and there'd be a puppet regime and everybody would live happily ever after. Well, it didn't happen. What I thought might happen is that you'd sort of have partisans and resistance fighters carrying on a struggle in Ukraine, and possibly the Ukraine army, or a lot of the Ukraine army, would be over the border in Poland or Moldova. So I thought in my, well, it was totally wrong. I thought Moldova might be a focal point for hostilities in the future, because they're not a member of NATO, whereas of course Poland is. So if the Russians get bogged down even more than they are now, will they move to stir up trouble in Moldova, for example? And what will the Chinese be doing? What sort of influence will they bring to bear on Russia, if any? Finally, Putin's position, I mean, it seems he's a sick man in more ways than one. And there isn't a regime change on the agenda, but inevitably these people come and go. What will replace him? You know, he's surrounded with sycophants and oligarchs, but has to be taken into consideration. I'm sure the Chinese government are looking at what happens after the demise of Putin. Just throwing a few things into the debate, Paul.
Thanks, Roy. Tony?
Yeah, if the West is, in fact, is not going to support Ukraine forever and ever, and I'll repeat that, if the West isn't going to support Ukraine forever and ever, because they won't, would it be best, in fact, if Ukrainians knew that that was the case and that they made their own decisions about whether they were prepared to fight on that basis, or that, in fact, you know, at some point, they have to come to the table? Because there's been a lot of rumors, actually, that this is already being discussed at an international level, and that in fact rumors strongly that Biden and the State Department was saying we ought to talk about the realities of how this carries on, and do we just let the Ukrainians, you know, fight with, you know, the fact of the matter is, I think that actually, you know, that a lot of what has happened so far has been because of Western armaments, and without those armaments, who is going to replace all those weapons? And also, I believe that Ukraine is a bit like a field research center. It's like the whole of Israel, for weapons. You can send weapons out there and they all get tested in an environment beyond human rights standards in Israel. And you get, and all these weapons are being tested beyond Western jurisdictions in Ukraine. I'm not sure whether I'm very comfortable with all of this. Where is the socialist governments around the world that wants to, that could replace European and Western arms? And I'm not saying that, you know, I think that would, clearly we're in a situation where we need to support Ukraine. But is it a blank check? Is that really what we're talking about?
Okay. Anybody else want to contribute? And then I'll give Fred the last 5 minutes, then we'll wind up if that's okay. Sue, did you want to say anything? Nigel, did you want to say anything? Are you okay? Nigel.
Well, I've been following your arguments and I agree with everything that's been said so far, so I really don't have anything extra to add. But I would like an easy to trot out gotcha argument for supporting the Ukraine. I've come across people who still say it's obviously NATO's fault. The Americans have been the villains for such a long time. How can we now ally with them? And I haven't got an easy answer. I can go through everything you said, but it needs to be a lot more succinct than the rather labored question I'm posing. Is there?
Did NATO invade Ukraine?
No.
Well, there's your answer. There's your simple.
No, but NATO made Russia react when it would have been much better for NATO not to threaten Russia, and now Russia's having to lash out.
So,
yeah, I think that's rubbish as well.
Still doesn't explain that Russia did the invading. I mean, NATO didn't invade Ukraine. Russia did.
Yep, so, I know. Yep. So, I've also got Ukrainian friends here in Belgium. One of them passed me a Russian propaganda sheet, which was written officially, which came out of RIA Novosti, which is like an official mouthpiece of the Russian regime. And it really is dreadful reading of what they want to do to Ukraine and Ukrainians. It's horrible.
I mean, would we have said to the Vietnamese during the Vietnamese War that the spread of communism in Southeast Asia is a provocation to the United States that therefore justifies the US invasion of an occupation of Vietnam, to curb the threat and the provocation from the spread of communism in that part of the world? Would we have supported the United States argument on that?
I think that's a difficult one, because my reading of the history is that the United States went in to help the sitting west-leaning Vietnamese government, but the Viet Minh, the original resistance fighters going against the Americans, or going against the French, sorry, were actually not worried, not at all concerned about communism, and were taking help from anybody who would get rid of the foreigners. That's my understanding of the origins.
Whatever that argument is, Nigel, later on, when the US were there, the US argument was there, we were stopping the spread of communism, no doubt about it. And therefore their argument was for going into Vietnam was that communism was a threat to the Western way of life. It was, the domino theory was quite, that if we don't stop it there, it will spread elsewhere. And therefore we've got to intervene. That's the same argument that Russia's using today, but we as a left wouldn't have stood for that in terms of an argument involving the United States in Vietnam. We stood very clearly on the side of the Vietnamese, fighting for the independence of their country and their right to self-determination. And yet the left today seems blind to that argument. Aren't they?
Or were the Russian propagandists a bit too clever and foresaw the reaction and then fed the various pro-Russian mouthpieces to give those pro-Russian anti-West arguments?
I suspect that the Russians will throw every type of argument that they can in order to justify what they did, in the same way that the US did in Vietnam. They still invaded Ukraine.
Yep.
NATO didn't invade Ukraine.
Yep, I understand that. But I
So
still keep coming up.
but you asked for a simple riposte. That's the simple riposte. Obviously, the world is slightly more complex than that in many, and we can go into the complexities and the contradictions and what have you.
But, it's very much more complicated.
Of course.
If you're on the left, do you automatically support the current Afghan government? Of course not. Of course not.
Well, I support the right of the Afghan people
Of course it's
to
not.
determine their own future.
So do I, but if they're dominated by their own people, do we then, I don't know.
Does that justify an invasion?
No.
You don't, just because we don't
but
like a country and we think they're nasty and horrible doesn't give you the right to invade them.
I just
Does
think,
it?
I just think it's complicated.
Anyway, it is complicated, but I still think it doesn't give you the right to invade. Otherwise, we'd be invading half the countries in the world.
Well,
There's half of them we don't like.
Take that, but once people have invaded, we have to go somewhere with this. It has to go somewhere, and it will end in a stalemate. And eventually there will be a settlement, maybe at 4, 5, 6 years, but and the Ukrainians will have to work out that settlement with the Russians.
Well, no,
Everything has to. What I really strongly feel, I suppose, is that in a situation of war, everything gets oversimplified, so that it just means you're either on one side or the other. It becomes a grossly simplified situation. And somehow we have to move on from that into a situation in which people who live in these areas can work out with each other what they want to do with each other.
What we do know from
more weapons, the more weapons that go into it, the more it escalates warfare, and the less likelihood of a settlement.
Well, what we know from history, sorry, Fred, what we know from history, because I've got this in my head, what we know from history is that countries that invade other countries get defeated in the end. Whether that's Vietnam, whether that's Iraq, whether that's Afghanistan, and it will happen in Ukraine. At some point, the Russians will be defeated. The only question is, how long will it go on for, and how many people are going to die in the meantime?
Yeah.
And the only people who can make the decisions about how long it goes on for and how many people are going to die are the Ukrainian people.
And the Russian people.
Well, no, but I don't think the Russian people are going to have much say in this at all, unfortunately. I mean, that's the other equation, of course, and Roy pointed to this, is that something could happen in Russia. The military could say, as happened with Vietnam, the military defeat of the US was against this tiny nation called Vietnam. they were clearly defeated, despite all their arms. And the military would have said to Nixon, Nixon, we've lost. In fact, they did say well before Nixon that they'd lost, but but Nixon eventually just pulled out because the contradictions were such in America itself, because the American people turned against the war and they knew that they'd lost. The same could happen in Russia. Putin we could wake up tomorrow and there's been a putsch in Russia and Putin's gone. Because the military are fed up with all their troops dying and they're not winning the war. Anyway, Fred, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, who knows? Let's remember about Vietnam. Actually, the Soviet Union and China did encourage Vietnam to, in the late 50s, early 60s, to agree to a temporary division of the country in order to have peace. And the Vietnamese, and there was an agreement for having elections, which was, across the whole of the country, north and south, and that was totally ignored. And the war continued. And by the way, the Vietnamese didn't fight just the French and the Americans; they fought the Japanese before that as well, right? So, and it lasted. So, and the Vietnamese and the Algerians, for example, as well, right? They conducted the war at the same time as carrying on negotiations. In fact, the best place to have negotiations is to get the best outcome on the ground as well. So it's a terrible suffering the Ukrainians are going through. But as long as they want to fight, the conditions under which they want to have a peace agreement is really up to them. And we can't determine that. And the only thing we can do is to say we support them. I suppose it's a bit, I don't want to, it's not a really good comparison, but the miners' strike, it lasted for a whole year. We knew it was very, very difficult because after a while, none of the other unions wanted to come out and support and taking strike action and so on and so forth. And it was just, we never said, give up now because you're only going to fight for another 3 months or 6 months and you're going to lose, right? We did say that as long as they were prepared to fight, we supported them. And that was the right thing there. And it's the right thing to say in Ukraine as well. And in the book here, by the way, there's a chapter called 10 Terrible Leftist Arguments Against the Ukrainian Resistance by an Ukrainian woman called Oksana Dudchak. So it takes up some of these arguments from their own point of view, right? So as Ukrainians. So that's one encouragement to me plugging the book to write it. It also has quite an extensive chapter on a short history of Ukraine, which is actually very good by one of the leading academic historians on Ukraine. So I'll just be brief on a few points. Can Russia sustain the war? Of course, it's a bigger country economically than Ukraine, but just like there's something like nearly 1 million people, million men who've left Russia rather than be conscripted. Don't forget that. And the troops they're throwing into the war are cannon fodder. They're not being, they're not being equipped properly. They're having to buy their own equipment. They're not being trained properly. So yeah, the possibility of Putin falling, not replaced by somebody necessarily progressive, but it does open the political situation. I don't know. Who knows where that will go. So let's not forget that dimension in terms of the war as well. In terms of what Paul and I described as campism, our enemies are maybe not necessarily our friends, but they're certainly not our enemies either, right? So, we can't really support the Ukrainians because they're being backed by the Americans, Western imperialism. So what? The left call for the arming of the left call for British and French imperialism to arm Republican Spain. It was the right thing to do. The Irish Republicans in 1917 got armed from the Kaiser in their war of independence against England. Nobody says that's terrible, right? They were supported by the Germans, and we can't support them. But you see, the problem about the argument about the Ukrainians are being manipulated by Western imperialism. We heard that over, the movements for democracy in the Czechoslovakia, in Hungary. But now, discussing with some people in Barnet, where I live, some people have brought up this argument about regarding the women and the population of Iran. They're being manipulated by Western imperialism, by Western media. They shouldn't be, they should got to be really careful about this, because who's going to be replacing them? It's going to be the monarchists. It's going to be the monarchists who are going to replace the Iranian regime now, and they're in the pockets of Western imperialism. And my attitude as a socialist, like hopefully everybody here, is that we support the Iranian women and girls and the whole of the population fighting for democratic rights in Iran, fighting for the right of women to wear what they want to wear, to have the right to choose whether to have children or not, etc., etc. Right, regardless of whether Western media are pushing Western propaganda in there. It'd be surprising if in any mass movement, Western powers, pro-capitalist powers, were not trying to influence the outcome. That's always true. And if we abstain from that as leftists, as socialists, as internationalists, then we leave the entire field over to the pro-capitalist, etc., the pro-NATO forces, and we've got to fight our corner in there and say, look, there is another outcome, an outcome which, of reconstruction, which is based on social, economic, and climate justice and democracy and feminism, etc., right? So that's and just to conclude on the point that Paul said about the left and NATO, right? NATO is not a force for democracy, and it's a military alliance, and ultimately we do want to have its disbandment along with other military alliances, whether in the Pacific or elsewhere, and it's a big change in the Labour Party with Starmer threatening to discipline MPs who are prepared to criticise NATO in this war, right? You've got to support NATO, so that's the role that we have to play. The Ukraine Solidarity Campaign has to play. Solidarity with the trade unions, the feminist organisations which do exist, and there are some of the women activists from there in this book, right? Solidarity with the trade union movement, fighting for independence for their country and against neoliberalism, and for a better future for their own country. So buy the book, and you can't go home until you buy a copy of the book. You're muted, Paul.
On that really positive note, one thing we can do to support the Ukrainian resistance and the progressive Ukrainian is buy the book. No doubt that can help and spread the word. And because I haven't got the book yet, but I've seen what the contents of it, and I'm going to buy it. So that's at least one sale you've got, Fred, from tonight. So please promote it. It's Tony, I think are you going to buy it as well?
Yeah, I want to say I want to support the distribution of this book, because I think that one of the worst things about this situation is that we're not learning the truth. And I think what we can all agree as socialists is we need really to know much more about what is in fact going on. Yeah. The media is as usual letting us down appallingly, and there needs to be a massive amount more information about just what is happening.
Well, yep. ISW could buy a small number of books, and you could, distribute it directly.
Give them away.
Or if you want to, or get whatever money you can get out of people.
Well, the other thing that I was going to suggest that we can do as well, which is very concrete, and we did this before, because if you remember a few months back, we did have a Ukrainian speaker from Ukraine Solidarity Campaign, and afterwards we made a donation as a group to them. And I think we should do that again. I mean, Fred, you don't need the money, do you? Normally, you'd be happy for us to make a donation to Ukraine Solidarity following tonight's meeting from our...
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And any revenue that we make on the book goes to the campaign. And the Solidarity Campaign's raised money and given that directly to trade unions to buy. Some of the trade unions have got their own territorial defence unit, and we've helped them buy some equipment. These are modest donations, a few £1,000s, right? And helped also financially social movement in terms of being a left progressive anti-capitalist voice in Ukraine, right? So as I said, any revenue from the book sales also go to organisations in Ukraine.
So I'll have a word with our treasurer, Derek, who's left the meeting, and ensure that we get a donation to Ukraine Solidarity after tonight's meeting. And I'll also get some books, as you suggest, Fred, for us to sell or give away. I think that's probably the end of the meeting, is it? Anybody got any last minute? Sue, you're the only one that hasn't said anything. You sure you don't want to say anything?
Yeah, I've just bought the book actually, because I kind of think I know nothing about Ukraine or Russia or the history of all of this or the background of it or nothing. And all you're hearing from the media, and you're not hearing the truth, the whole truth. So yeah, I just don't feel I know enough about it really to know what I think about what side I come down on.
But that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah.
And I think to end on that note, that we get the book, we agree to promote the book so that more people are aware of the different arguments. And these are the voices from Ukrainians and Ukrainian activists on the progressive stroke left in Ukraine. So it's really important in this context that their voices are heard. So thanks, Sue, for stressing that. And on that note, I'm going to end the meeting.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for inviting me. Good to meet all of you. Yeah, and I'll see you
Fred.
on the picket lines and demonstrations and all that.
And I hope to see those of Nigel, I won't see you, Fred, but I hope everybody else will meet at the social event on the 13th of December. Have something to eat, drink, a chat, a natter, plan the revolution for next year.
Absolutely.
And we'll take it forward. Solidarity. Thank you very much.
Good night, comrades.
Yeah.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Right.